Ch5, the first story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eugene Smith. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J. M. Rigg. Day 5, the first story. Cimon, by loving, waxes wise, wins his wife Iphigenia by capture on the high seas, and is imprisoned at Rhodes. He is delivered by Lysimachus, and the twain capture Cassandra and recapture Iphigenia in the hour of their marriage. They flee with their ladies to Crete, and having there married them, are brought back to their homes. Many stories, sweet my ladies, occur to me as meet for me to tell by way of ushering in a day so joyous as this will be, of which one does most commend itself to my mind, because not only has it one of those happy endings of which today we are in quest, but 'twill enable you to understand how holy, how mighty, and how salutary are the forces of love, which not a few, witting not what they say, do most unjustly reprobate and reviled, which, if I err not, should to you, for that I take you to be enamoured, be indeed welcome. Once upon a time, then, as we have read in the ancient histories of the Cypriots, there was in the island of Cyprus a very great noble named Aristippus, a man rich in all worldly goods beyond all other of his countrymen, and who might have deemed himself incomparably blessed, but for a single sore affliction that fortune had allotted him, which was that among his sons he had one, the best grown and handsomest of them all, that was well nigh a hopeless imbecile. His true name was Galesus, but as neither his tutor's pains, nor his father's coaxing or chastisement, nor any other method had availed to imbue him with any tincture of letters or manners, but he still remained gruff and savage of voice, and in his bearing liker to a beast than to a man, all, as in derision, were wont to call him Cimon, which in their language signifies the same as bestione, brute, in ours. The father, grieved beyond measure to see his son's life thus blighted, and having abandoned all hope of his recovery, nor caring to have the cause of his mortification ever before his eyes, bade him betake him to the farm, and there keep with his husbandmen. To Cimon the change was very welcome, because the manners and habits of the uncouth hinds were more to his taste than those of the citizens. So to the farm Cimon hied him, and addressed himself to the work thereof. And being thus employed, he chanced one afternoon, as he passed, staff on shoulder, from one domain to another, to enter a plantation, the like of which for beauty there was not in those parts, and which was then, for 'twas the month of May, a mass of greenery. And as he traversed it, he came, as fortune was pleased to guide him, to a meadow girt in with trees exceeding tall, and having in one of its corners a fountain most fair and cool, beside which he espied a most beautiful girl, lying asleep on the green grass, clad only in a vest of such fine stuff that it scarce in any measure veiled the whiteness of her flesh, and below the waist naught but an apron most white and fine of texture, and likewise at her feet there slept 2 women and a man, her slaves. No sooner did Cimon catch sight of her, than, as if he had never before seen form of woman, he stopped short, and leaning on his cudgel, regarded her intently, saying never a word, and lost in admiration. And in his rude soul, which, despite 1,000 lessons, had hitherto remained impervious to every delight that belongs to urbane life, he felt the awakening of an idea that bade his gross and coarse mind acknowledge that this girl was the fairest creature that had ever been seen by mortal eye. and thereupon he began to distinguish her several parts, praising her hair, which showed to him as gold, her brow, her nose and mouth, her throat and arms, and above all her bosom, which was as yet but in bud. And as he gazed, he changed of a sudden from a husbandman into a judge of beauty, and desired of all things to see her eyes, which the weight of her deep slumber kept close shut, and many a time he would fain have awakened her, that he might see them. But so much fairer seemed she to him than any other woman that he had seen, that he doubted she must be a goddess. And he was not so devoid of sense, but that he deemed things divine more worthy of reverence than things mundane. He forbore, and waited until she should wake of her own accord. And though he found the delay overlong, yet, enthralled by so unwonted a delight, he knew not how to be going. However, after he had tarried a long while, it so befell that Iphigenia, such was the girl's name, her slave still sleeping, awoke, and raised her head, and opened her eyes, and seeing Cimon standing before her, leaning on his staff, was not a little surprised, and said, "Cimon, what seekest thou in this wood at this hour?" For Cimon she knew well, as indeed did almost all in the countryside, by reason alike of his uncouth appearance as of the rank and wealth of his father. To Iphigenia's question he answered never a word, but as soon as her eyes were open, naught could he do but intently regard them, for it seemed to him that a soft influence emanated from them, which filled his soul with a delight that he had never before known, which the girl marking, began to misdoubt that by so fixed a scrutiny his boorish temper might be prompted to some act that should cause her dishonour. Wherefore she roused her women, and got up, saying, "Keep thy distance, Cimon, in God's name." Whereto Cimon made answer, "I will come with thee." And albeit the girl refused his escort, being still in fear of him, she could not get quit of him. But he attended her home, after which he hied him straight to his father's house, and announced that he was minded on no account to go back to the farm, which intelligence was far from welcome to his father and kinsmen, but nevertheless they suffered him to stay, and waited to see what might be the reason of his change of mind. So Cimon, whose heart, closed to all teaching, love's shaft, sped by the beauty of Iphigenia, had penetrated, did now graduate in wisdom with such celerity as to astonish his father and kinsmen, and all that knew him. He began by requesting his father to let him go clad in the like apparel, and with, in all respects, the like personal equipment as his brothers, which his father very gladly did. Mixing thus with the gallants, and becoming familiar with the manners proper to gentlemen, and especially to lovers, he very soon, to the exceeding great wonder of all, not only acquired the rudiments of letters, but waxed most eminent among the philosophic wits. After which, for no other cause than the love he bore to Iphigenia, he not only modulated his gruff and boorish voice to a degree of smoothness suitable to urbane life, but made himself accomplished in singing and music. In riding also, and in all matters belonging to war, as well by sea as by land, he waxed most expert and hardy. And in sum, that I go not about to enumerate each of his virtues in detail, he had not completed the 4th year from the stay of his first becoming enamoured, before he was grown the most gallant and courteous, aye, and the most perfect in particular accomplishments of the young cavaliers that were in the island of Cyprus. What then, gracious ladies, are we to say of Cimon? Verily, naught else but that the high faculties with which heaven had endowed his noble soul, invidious fortune had bound with the strongest of cords, and circumscribed within a very narrow region of his heart. All which cords love, more potent than fortune, burst and break in pieces, and then, with the might wherewith he wakens dormant powers, he brought them forth of the cruel obfuscation in which they lay, into clear light, plainly showing thereby whence he may withdraw, and whither he may guide, by his beams the souls that are subject to his sway. Now, albeit by his love for Iphigenia Cimon was betrayed, as young lovers very frequently are, into some peccadilloes, yet Aristippus, reflecting that it had turned him from a booby into a man, not only bore patiently with him, but exhorted him with all his heart to continue steadfast in his love. And Cimon, who still refused to be called Galesus, because 'twas as Cimon that Iphigenia had first addressed him, being desirous to accomplish his desire by honourable means, did many a time urge his suit upon her father Cypsius, that he would give her him to wife. Whereto Cypsius always made the same answer, to wit, that he had promised her to Pasimondas, a young Rhodian noble, and was not minded to break faith with him. However, the time appointed for Iphigenia's wedding being come, and the bridegroom having sent for her, Cimon said to himself, "'Tis now for me to show thee, Iphigenia, how great is my love for thee. 'Tis by thee that I am grown a man, nor doubt I, if I shall have thee, that I shall wax more glorious than a god, and verily thee I will have, or die." Having so said, he privily enlisted in his cause certain young nobles that were his friends, and secretly fitted out a ship with all equipment meet for combat, and put to sea on the lookout for the ship that was to bear Iphigenia to Rhodes and her husband. And at length, when her father had done lavishing honours upon her husband's friends, Iphigenia embarked, and the mariners, shaping their course for Rhodes, put to sea. Cimon was on the alert, and overhauled them the very next day, and standing on his ship's prow, shouted amain to those that were aboard Iphigenia's ship, "Bring to, strike sails, or look to be conquered and sunk in the sea." Then, seeing that the enemy had gotten their arms above deck, and were making ready to make a fight of it, he followed up his words by casting a grapnel upon the poop of the Rhodians, who were making great way, and having thus made their poop fast to his prow, he sprang, fierce as a lion, reckless whether he were followed or no, onto the Rhodian ship, making, as it were, no account of them, and animated by love, hurled himself, sword in hand, with prodigious force among the enemy, and cutting and thrusting right and left, slaughtered them like sheep. Insomuch that the Rhodians, marking the fury of his onset, threw down their arms, and as with one voice did all acknowledge themselves his prisoners. To whom Cimon, "Gallants," quoth he, "'twas neither lust or beauty nor enmity to you that caused me to put out from Cyprus to attack you here with force of arms on the high seas. Moved was I thereto by that which to gain is to me a matter great indeed, which peaceably to yield me is to you but a slight matter. For 'tis even Iphigenia, whom more than aught else I love, whom, as I might not have her of her father in peaceable and friendly sort, love has constrained me to take from you in this high-handed fashion, and by force of arms, to whom I mean to be even such as would have been your Pasimondas. Wherefore give her to me, and go your way, and God's grace go with you." Yielding rather to force than prompted by generosity, the Rhodians surrendered Iphigenia, all tears, to Cimon, who, marking her tears, said to her, "Grieve not, noble lady, thy Cimon am I, who, by my long love, have established a far better right to thee than Pasimondas by the faith that was plighted to him." So saying, he sent her aboard his ship, whither he followed her, touching naught that belonged to the Rhodians, and suffering them to go their way. To have gotten so dear a prize made him the happiest man in the world, but for a time 'twas all he could do to assuage her grief. Then, after taking counsel with his comrades, he deemed it best not to return to Cyprus for the present, and so, by common consent, they shaped their course for Crete, where most of them, and especially Cimon, had alliances of old or recent date, and friends not a few, whereby they deemed that they might tarry with Iphigenia in security. But fortune, that had accorded Cimon so gladsome a capture of the lady, suddenly proved fickle, and converted the boundless joy of the enamoured gallant into woeful and bitter lamentation. 'Twas not yet full 4 hours since Cimon had parted from the Rhodians, when, with the approach of night, that night from which Cimon hoped such joyance as he had never known, came weather most turbulent and tempestuous, which wrapped the heavens in cloud, and swept the sea with scathing blasts, whereby 'twas not possible for any to see how the ship was to be worked or steered, or to steady himself so as to do any duty upon her deck. Whereat what grief was Cimon's, it boots not to ask. Indeed, it seemed to him that the gods had granted his heart's desire only that it might be harder for him to die, which had else been to him but a light matter. Not less downcast were his comrades, but most of all Iphigenia, who, weeping bitterly, and shuddering at every wave that struck the ship, did cruelly curse Cimon's love, and censure his rashness, averring that this tempest was come upon them for no other cause than that the gods had decreed that, as 'twas in despite of their will that he purposed to espouse her, he should be frustrate of his presumptuous intent, and having lived to see her expire, should then himself meet a woeful death. While thus, and yet more bitterly, they bewailed them, and the mariners were at their wits' end, as the gale grew hourly more violent, nor knew they, nor might conjecture, whither they went, they drew nigh the island of Rhodes, albeit that Rhodes it was they wist not, and set themselves, as best and most skilfully they might, to run the ship aground, in which enterprise fortune favoured them, bringing them into a little bay, where, shortly before them, was arrived the Rhodian ship that Cimon had let go. Nor were they sooner aware that 'twas Rhodes they had made, than day broke, and the sky thus brightening a little, they saw that they were about a bow shot from the ship that they had released on the preceding day. Whereupon Cimon, vexed beyond measure, being apprehensive of that which in fact befell them, bade make every effort to win out of the bay, and let fortune carry them whither she would, for nowhere might they be in worse plight than there. So might and main they strove to bring the ship out, but all in vain. The violence of the gale thwarted them to such purpose as not only to preclude their passage out of the bay, but to drive them, willing-nilling, ashore, whither no sooner were they come than they were recognized by the Rhodian mariners who had already landed, of whom one ran with all speed to a farm hard by, whither the Rhodian gallants were gone, and told them that fortune had brought Cimon and Iphigenia aboard their ship into the same bay to which she had guided them. Whereat the gallants were overjoyed, and taking with them not a few of the farm servants, hied them in hot haste to the shore, where, Cimon and his men being already landed with intent to take refuge in a neighbouring wood, they took them all, with Iphigenia, and brought them to the farm. Whence, pursuant to an order of the Senate of Rhodes, to which, so soon as he received the news, Pasimondus made his complaint, Cimon and his men were all marched off to prison by Lysimachus, chief magistrate of the Rhodians for that year, who came down from the city for the purpose with an exceeding great company of men-at-arms. On such wise did our hapless and enamoured Cimon lose his so lately won Iphigenia before he had had of her more than a kiss or two. Iphigenia was entertained and comforted of the annoy, occasioned as well by her recent capture as by fury of the sea, by not a few noble ladies of Rhodes, with whom she tarried until the day appointed for her marriage. In recompense of the release of the Rhodian gallants on the preceding day, the lives of Cimon and his men were spared, notwithstanding that Pasimondus pressed might and main for their execution, and instead they were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, wherein, as may be supposed, they abode in dolorous plight, and despaired of ever again knowing happiness. However, it so befell that, Passamandus accelerating his nuptials to the best of his power, Fortune, as if repenting her that in her haste she had done Cimon so evil a turn, did now by a fresh disposition of events compass his deliverance. Passamandus had a brother, by name Hormisdas, his equal in all respects save in years, who had long been contract to marry Cassandra, a fair and noble damsel of Rhodes, of whom Lysimachus was in the last degree enamoured. But owing to divers accidents, the marriage had been from time to time put off. Now Passamandus, being about to celebrate his nuptials with exceeding great pomp, bethought him that he could do no better than, to avoid a repetition of the pomp and expense, arrange, if so he might, that his brother should be wedded on the same day with himself. So, having consulted anew with Cassandra's kinsfolk, and come to an understanding with them, he and his brother and they conferred together, and agreed that on the same day that Passamandus married Iphigenia, Hormisdas should marry Cassandra. Lysimachus, getting wind of this arrangement, was mortified beyond measure, seeing himself thereby deprived of the hope which he cherished of marrying Cassandra himself, if Hormisdas should not forestall him. But like a wise man he concealed his chagrin, and cast about how he might frustrate the arrangement, to which end he saw no other possible means but to carry Cassandra off. It did not escape him that the office which he held would render this easily feasible, but he deemed it all the more dishonourable than if he had not held the office. But, in short, after much pondering, honour yielded place to love, and he made up his mind that, come what might, he would carry Cassandra off. Then, as he took thought what company he should take with him, and how he should go about the affair, he remembered Cimon, whom he had in prison with his men, and it occurred to him that he could not possibly have a better or more trusty associate in such an enterprise than Cimon. Wherefore, the same night, he caused Cimon to be brought privily to him in his own room, and thus addressed him: "Cimon, as the gods are most generous and liberal to bestow their gifts on men, so are they also most sagacious to try their virtue, and those whom they find to be firm and steadfast in all circumstances they honour as the most worthy with the highest rewards. They have been minded to be certified of thy worth by better proofs than thou couldst afford them, as long as thy life was bounded by thy father's house amid the superabundant wealth which I know him to possess. Wherefore, in the first place, they so wrought upon thee with the shrewd incitements of love, that from an insensate brute, as I have heard, thou grewest to be a man. Since when it has been, and is their intent, to try whether evil fortune and harsh imprisonment may avail to change thee from the temper that was thine, when for a short while thou hadst joyance of the prize thou hadst won. And so thou prove the same that thou wast then, they have in store for thee a boon incomparably greater than aught that they vouchsafed thee before. What that boon is, to the end thou mayest recover heart and thy wonted energy, I will now explain to thee. Passamandus, exultant in thy misfortune, and eager to compass thy death, hastens to the best of his power his nuptials with thy Iphigenia, that so may he enjoy the prize that fortune, erstwhile smiling, gave thee, and forthwith, frowning, reft from thee. Whereat how sore must be thy grief, if rightly I gauge thy love, I know by my own case, seeing that his brother Hormisdas addresses himself to do me on the same day a like wrong in regard of Cassandra, whom I love more than aught else in the world. Nor see I that fortune has left us any way of escape from this her unjust and cruel spite, save what we may make for ourselves by a resolved spirit and the might of our right hands. Take we then the sword, and therewith make we each prize of his lady, thou for the second, I for the first time. For so thou value the recovery, I say not of thy liberty, for without thy lady I doubt thou wouldst hold it cheap, but of thy lady The gods have placed it in thine own hands, if thou art but minded to join me in my enterprise." These words restored to Cimon all that he had lost of heart and hope, nor pondered he long before he replied: "Lysimachus, comrade stouter or more staunch than I thou mightest not have in such an enterprise, if such indeed is be as thou sayest. Wherefore lay upon me such behest as thou shalt deem meet, and thou shalt marvel to witness the vigour of my performance." Whereupon Lysimachus: "On the 3rd day from now," quoth he, "their husbands' houses will be newly entered by the brides, and on the same day, at even, we too will enter them in arms, thou with thy men, and I with some of mine, in whom I place great trust. And forcing our way among the guests, and slaughtering all that dare to oppose us, will bear the ladies off to a ship which I have had privily got ready." Cimon approved the plan, and kept quiet in prison until the appointed time, which being come, the nuptials were celebrated with great pomp and magnificence that filled the houses of the two brothers with festal cheer. Then Lysimachus, having made ready all things meet, and fired Cimon and his men and his own friends for the enterprise by a long harangue, disposed them in due time, all bearing arms under their cloaks, in 3 companies, and having privily dispatched one company to the port, that when the time should come to embark he might meet with no let, he marched with the other 2 companies to the house of Pasimondus, posted the one company at the gate, that being entered they might not be shut in or debarred their egress, and with the other company and Cimon ascended the stairs, and gained the saloon, where the brides and not a few other ladies were set at several tables to sup in meet order. Whereupon in they rushed, and overthrew the tables, and seized each his own lady, and placed them in charge of their men, whom they bade bear them off forthwith to the ship that lay ready to receive them. Whereupon the brides and the other ladies and the servants with one accord fell a sobbing and shrieking, insomuch that a confused din and lamentation filled the whole place. Cimon, Lysimachus, and their band, none withstanding, but all giving way before them, gained the stairs, which they were already descending when they encountered Pasimondus, who, carrying a great staff in his hand, was making in the direction of the noise. But one doughty stroke of Cimon's sword sufficed to cleave his skull in twain, and lay him dead at Cimon's feet. And another stroke disposed of hapless Hormisdas, as he came running to his brother's aid. Some others who ventured to approach them were wounded and beaten off by the retinue. So forth of the house, that reeked with blood and resounded with tumult and lamentation and woe, sped Cimon and Lysimachus with all their company, and without any let, in close order, with their fair booty in their midst, made good their retreat to the ship. Whereon with the ladies they one and all embarked, for the shore was now full of armed men come to rescue the ladies, and the oarsmen, giving way, put to sea elate. Arrived at Crete, they met with a hearty welcome on the part of their many friends and kinsfolk, and having married their ladies, they made greatly merry, and had gladsome joyance of their fair booty. Their doings occasioned, both in Cyprus and in Rhodes, no small stir and commotion, which lasted for a long while. But in the end, by the good offices of their friends and kinsfolk in both islands, 'twas so ordered as that after a certain term of exile, Cimon returned with Iphigenia to Cyprus, and in like manner Lysimachus returned with Cassandra to Rhodes. And long and blithely thereafter lived they, each well contented with his own wife in his own land. End of Day 5, the first story.
Day 5, the second story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the second story. Costanza loves Martuccio Gomito, and hearing that he is dead, gives way to despair, and hies her alone aboard a boat, which is wafted by the wind to Susa. She finds him alive in Tunis, and makes herself known to him, who, having by his counsel gained high place in the king's favour, marries her, and returns with her wealthy to Lipari.
Pamphilo's story being ended, the queen, after commending it not a little, called for one to follow from Emilia, who thus began.
Meet and right it is that one should rejoice when events so fall out that passion meets with its due reward, and as love merits in the long run rather joy than suffering, far gladlier obey I the queen's than I did the king's behest, and address myself to our present theme. You are to know then, dainty ladies, that not far from Sicily there is an islet called Lipari, in which, no great while ago, there dwelt a damsel, Costanza by name, fair as fair could be, and of one of the most honourable families in the island. And one Martuccio Gomito, who was also of the island, a young man most gallant and courteous, and worthy for his condition, became enamoured of Costanza, who in like manner grew so afire for him that he was ever ill at ease except she saw him. Martuccio, craving her to wife, asked her of her father, who made answer that, Martuccio being poor, he was not minded to give her to him. Mortified to be thus rejected by reason of poverty, Martuccio took an oath in presence of some of his friends and kinsfolk that Lipari should know him no more until he was wealthy. So away he sailed, and took to scouring the seas as a rover on the coast of Barbary, preying upon all whose force matched not his own. In which way of life he found fortune favourable enough, had he but known how to rest and be thankful. But 'twas not enough that he and his comrades in no long time waxed very wealthy. Their covetousness was inordinate, and, while they sought to gratify it, they chanced in an encounter with certain Saracen ships to be taken after a long defence, and despoiled, and, most part of them, thrown into the sea by their captors, who, after sinking his ship, took Martuccio with them to Tunis, and clapped him in prison, and there kept him a long time in a very sad plight. Meanwhile, not by one or two, but by divers and not a few persons, tidings reached Lipari that all that were with Martuccio aboard his bark had perished in the sea. The damsel, whose grief on Martuccio's departure had known no bounds, now hearing that he was dead with the rest, wept a great while, and made up her mind to have done with life. But, lacking the resolution to lay violent hands upon herself, she bethought her how she might devote herself to death by some novel expedient. So one night she stole out of her father's house, and hied her to the port, and there by chance she found, lying a little apart from the other craft, a fishing boat, which, as the owners had but just quitted her, was still equipped with mast and sails and oars. Aboard which boat she forthwith got, and being, like most of the women of the island, not altogether without nautical skill, she rowed some distance out to sea, and then hoisted sail, and cast away oars and tiller, and let the boat drift, deeming that a boat without lading or steersman would certainly be either capsized by the wind, or dashed against some rock and broken in pieces, so that escape she could not, even if she would, but must perforce drown. And so, her head wrapped in a mantle, she stretched herself weeping on the floor of the boat. But it fell out quite otherwise than she had conjectured, for, the wind being from the north and very equable, with next to no sea, the boat kept an even keel, and next day about vespers bore her to land hard by a city called Susa, full 100 miles beyond Tunis. To the damsel 'twas all one whether she were at sea or ashore, for since she had been aboard she had never once raised, nor, come what might, meant she ever to raise, her head. Now it so chanced that, when the boat grounded, there was on the shore a poor woman that was in the employ of some fishermen, whose nets she was just taking out of the sunlight. Seeing the boat under full sail, she marvelled how it should be suffered to drive ashore, and conjectured that the fishermen on board were asleep. So to the boat she hied her, and finding therein only the damsel fast asleep, she called her many times, and at length awakened her, and perceiving by her dress that she was a Christian, she asked her in Latin how it was that she was come thither all alone in the boat. Hearing the Latin speech, the damsel wondered whether the wind had not shifted and carried her back to Lipari, so up she started, gazed about her, and finding herself ashore and the aspect of the country strange, asked the good woman where she was. To which the good woman made answer, "My daughter, thou art hard by Susa in Barbary." Whereupon the damsel, sorrowful that God had not seen fit to accord her the boon of death, apprehensive of dishonour, and at her wit's end, sat herself down at the foot of her boat, and burst into tears. Which the good woman saw not without pity, and persuaded her to come with her into her hut, and there by coaxing drew from her how she was come thither, and knowing that she could not but be fasting, she set before her her own coarse bread and some fish and water, and prevailed upon her to eat a little. Costanza thereupon asked her who she was that thus spoke Latin, whereto she answered that her name was Carapresa, and that she was from Trapani, where she had served some Christian fishermen. To the damsel, sad indeed though she was, this name Carapresa, wherefore she knew not, seemed to be of happy augury, so that she began to take hope, she knew not why, and to grow somewhat less fain of death. Wherefore, without disclosing who or whence she was, she earnestly besought the good woman for the love of God to have pity on her youth, and advise her how best to avoid insult. Whereupon Carapresa, good woman that she was, left her in her hut, while with all speed she picked up her nets, and on her return she wrapped her in her own mantle, and led her to Susa. Arrived there, she said to her, "Costanza, I shall bring thee to the house of an excellent Saracen lady, for whom I frequently do bits of work, as she has occasion. She is an old lady and compassionate. I will commend thee to her care as best I may, and I doubt not she will right gladly receive thee, and entreat thee as her daughter, and thou wilt serve her, and, while thou art with her, do all thou canst to gain her favour, until such time as God may send thee better fortune." And as she said, so she did. The old lady listened, and then, gazing steadfastly in the damsel's face, shed tears, and taking her hand, kissed her forehead, and led her into the house, where she and some other women dwelt quite by themselves, doing divers kinds of handiwork in silk and palm leaves and leather, wherein the damsel in a few days acquired some skill, and thenceforth wrought together with them, and rose wondrous high in the favour and good graces of all the ladies, who soon taught her their language. Now while the damsel, mourned at home as lost and dead, dwelt thus at Susa, it so befell that, Mariabdella being then king of Tunis, a young chieftain in Granada, of great power, and backed by mighty allies, gave out that the realm of Tunis belonged to him, and having gathered a vast army, made a descent upon Tunis with intent to expel the king from the realm. Matuccio Gomito, who knew the language of Barbary well, heard the tidings in prison, and learning that the king of Tunis was mustering a mighty host for the defence of his kingdom, said to one of the warders that were in charge of him and his comrades, "If I might have speech of the king, I am confident that the advice that I should give him would secure him the victory." The warder repeated these words to his chief, who forthwith carried them to the king. Wherefore by the king's command Martuccio was brought before him, and being asked by him what the advice of which he had spoken might be, answered on this wise: "Sire, if in old days, when I was wont to visit this country of yours, I duly observed the manner in which you order your battle, methinks you place your main reliance upon archers, and therefore if you could contrive that your enemy's supply of arrows should give out, and your own continue plentiful, I apprehend that you would win the battle." "Ay, indeed," replied the king, "I make no doubt that, could I but accomplish that, I should conquer." "Nay, but sire," returned Matuccio, "you may do it if you will. Listen, and I will tell you how. You must fit the bows of your archers with strings much finer than those that are in common use, and match them with arrows the notches of which will not admit any but these fine strings, and this you must do so secretly that your enemy may not know it, else he will find means to be even with you. Which counsel I give you for the following reason: when your and your enemy's archers have expended all their arrows, you wot that the enemy will fall to picking up the arrows that your men have shot during the battle, and your men will do the like by the enemy's arrows, but the enemy will not be able to make use of your men's arrows, by reason that their fine notches will not suffice to admit the stout strings, whereas your men will be in the contrary case in regard of the enemy's arrows, for the fine string will very well receive the large notched arrow, and so your men will have an abundant supply of arrows, while the enemy will be at a loss for them." The king, who lacked not sagacity, appreciated Martuccio's advice, and gave full effect to it, whereby he came out of the war a conqueror, and Martuccio, being raised to the chief place in his favour, waxed rich and powerful. Which matters being bruited throughout the country, it came to the ears of Costanza that Matuccio Gomito, whom she had long supposed to be dead, was alive, whereby her love for him, some embers of which still lurked in her heart, burst forth again in sudden flame, and gathered strength, and revived her dead hope. wherefore she frankly told all her case to the good lady with whom she dwelt, saying that she would fain go to Tunis, that her eyes might have assurance of that which the report received by her ears had made them yearn to see. The lady fell heartily in with the girl's desire, and, as if she had been her mother, embarked with her for Tunis, where on their arrival they were honourably received in the house of one of her kinswomen. Carapresa, who had attended her, being sent to discover what she might touching Martuccio, brought back word that he was alive, and high in honour and place. The gentlewoman was minded that none but herself should apprise Martuccio of the arrival of his Costanza, wherefore she hied her one day to Martuccio, and said, "Martuccio, there is come to my house a servant of thine from Lipari, who would fain speak with thee here privily, and for that he would not have me trust another, I am come hither myself to deliver his message." Martuccio thanked her, and forthwith hied him with her to her house, where no sooner did the girl see him than she all but died for joy, and carried away by her feelings fell upon his neck with open arms and embraced him, and, what with sorrow of his past woes and her present happiness, said never a word, but softly wept. Martuccio regarded her for a while in silent wonder, then, heaving a sigh, he said, "Thou livest then, my Costanza. Long since I heard that thou wast lost, nor was aught known of thee at home." Which said, he tenderly and with tears embraced her. Costanza told him all her adventures, and how honourably she had been entreated by the gentlewoman with whom she had dwelt. And so long time they conversed, and then Martuccio parted from her, and hied him back to his lord the king, and told him all, to wit, his own adventures and those of the girl, adding that with his leave he was minded to marry her according to our law. Which matters the king found passing strange, and having called the girl to him, and learned from her that 'twas even as Martuccio had said, "Well indeed," quoth he, "hast thou won thy husband." Then caused he gifts most ample and excellent to be brought forth, part of which he gave to Costanza and part to Martuccio, leaving them entirely to their own devices in regard of one another. Then Martuccio, in terms most honourable, bade farewell to the old lady with whom Costanza had dwelt, thanking her for the service she had rendered to Costanza, and giving her presents suited to her condition, and commending her to God, while Costanza shed many a tear. After which, by leave of the king, they went aboard a light bark, taking with them Carapresa, and, sped by a prosperous breeze, arrived at Lipari, where they were received with such cheer as 'twere vain to attempt to describe. There were Martuccio and Costanza, wedded with all pomp and splendour, and there long time in easeful peace they had joyance of their love. End of Day 5, the second story.
Day 5, the third story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the third story. Pietro Boccamazza runs away with Agnolella and encounters a gang of robbers. The girl takes refuge in a wood and is guided to a castle. Pietro is taken but escapes out of the hands of the robbers, and after some adventures arrives at the castle where Agnolella is, marries her, and returns with her to Rome.
Ended Emilia's story, which none of the company spared to commend. The queen, turning to Elisa, bade her follow suit, and she, with glad obedience, thus began.
'Tis a story sweet, ladies, of a woeful night passed by two indiscreet young lovers that I have in mind, but, as thereon ensued not a few days of joy, 'tis not inapposite to our argument, and shall be narrated. 'Tis no long time since at Rome, which albeit now the tale was of yore the head of the world, there dwelt a young man, Pietro Boccamazza by name, a scion of one of the most illustrious of the Roman houses, who became enamoured of a damsel exceeding fair, and amorous withal. her name Agnolella, the daughter of one Gigliuzzo Saulo, a plebeian, but in high repute among the Romans. Nor loving thus did Pietro lack the address to inspire in Agnolella a love as ardent as his own. Wherefore, overmastered by his passion, and minded no longer to endure the sore suffering that it caused him, he asked her in marriage. Whereof his kinsfolk were no sooner apprised, than with one accord they came to him, and strongly urged him to desist from his purpose. They also gave Gigliuzzo Saulo to understand that he were best to pay no sort of heed to Pietro's words, for that if he so did, they would never acknowledge him as friend or relative. Thus, to see himself debarred of the one way by which he deemed he might attain to his desire, Pietro was ready to die for grief, and, all his kinsfolk notwithstanding, he would have married Gigliuzzo's daughter, had but the father consented. Wherefore at length he made up his mind that if the girl were willing, naught should stand in the way, and having through a common friend sounded the damsel and found her apt, he brought her to consent to elope with him from Rome. The affair being arranged, Pietro and she took horse betimes one morning, and sallied forth for Anagni, where Pietro had certain friends in whom he placed much trust. And as they rode, time not serving for full joyance of their love, for they feared pursuit, they held converse thereof, and from time to time exchanged a kiss. Now it so befell that the way being none too well known to Pietro, when perhaps 8 miles from Rome they should have turned to the right, they took instead a leftward road. Whereon, when they had ridden but little more than 2 miles, they found themselves close to a petty castle, whence, so soon as they were observed, there issued some dozen men at arms. And as they drew near, the damsel, espying them, gave a cry, and said, "We are attacked, Pietro, let us flee." And guiding her nag as best she knew towards a great forest, she planted the spurs in his sides, and so, holding on by the saddle bow, was borne by the goaded creature into the forest at a gallop. Pietro, who had been too engrossed with her face to give due heed to the way, and thus had not been aware, as soon as she, of the approach of the men at arms, was still looking about to see whence they were coming, when they came upon him, and took him prisoner, and forced him to dismount. Then they asked who he was, and when he told them, they conferred among themselves, saying, "This is one of the friends of our enemies. What else can we do but relieve him of his nag and of his clothes, and hanging on one of these oaks in scorn of the Orsini?" To which proposal all agreeing, they bade Pietro strip himself, but while already divining his fate, he was so doing, an ambuscade of full 25 men at arms fell suddenly upon them, crying, "Death! Death!" Thus surprised, they let Pietro go and stood on the defensive, but, seeing that the enemy greatly outnumbered them, they took to their heels, the others giving chase. Whereupon Pietro hastily resumed his clothes, mounted his nag, and fled with all speed in the direction which he had seen the damsel take. But finding no road or path through the forest, nor discerning any trace of a horse's hoofs, he was, for that he found not the damsel, albeit he deemed himself safe out of the clutches of his captors and their assailants, the most wretched man alive, and fell a weeping and wandering hither and thither about the forest, uttering Agnolella's name. None answered, but turn back he dare not, so on he went, not knowing whither he went, besides which he was in mortal dread of the wild beasts that infest the forest, as well on account of himself as of the damsel, whom momently he seemed to see throttled by some bear or wolf. Thus did our unfortunate Pietro spend the whole day wandering about the forest, making it to resound with his cries of Agnolella's name, and harking at times back when he thought to go forward. until at last, what with his cries and his tears and his fears and his long fasting, he was so spent that he could go no further. 'Twas then nightfall, and as he knew not what else to do, he dismounted at the foot of an immense oak, and having tethered his nag to the trunk, climbed up into the branches, lest he should be devoured by the wild beasts during the night. Shortly afterwards the moon rose with a very clear sky, and Pietro, who dared not sleep lest he should fall, and indeed had he been secure from that risk, his misery and his anxiety on account of the damsel would not have suffered him to sleep, kept watch, sighing and weeping and cursing his evil luck. Now the damsel, who, as we said before, had fled she knew not whither, allowing her nag to carry her whithersoever he would, strayed so far into the forest that she lost sight of the place where she had entered it, and spent the whole day just as Pietro had done, wandering about the wilderness, pausing from time to time, and weeping and uttering his name, and bewailing her evil fortune. At last, seeing that 'twas now the vesper hour and Pietro came not, she struck into a path which the nag followed, until, after riding some 2 miles, she espied at some distance a cottage, for which she made with all speed, and found there a good man, well stricken in years, with his wife, who was likewise aged. Seeing her ride up alone, they said, "Daughter, wherefore ridest thou thus alone at this hour in these parts?" Weeping, the damsel made answer that she had lost her companion in the forest, and asked how far might Anagni be from there. "My daughter," returned the good man, "this is not the road to Anagni. 'Tis more than 12 miles away." "And how far off," inquired the damsel, "are the nearest houses in which one might find lodging for the night?" "There are none so near," replied the good man, "that thou canst reach them today." "Then, so please you," said the damsel, "since go elsewhither I cannot, for God's sake let me pass the night here with you." Whereto the good man made answer, "Damsel, welcome art thou to tarry the night with us, but still thou art to know that these parts are infested both by day and by night by bands, which, be they friends or be they foes, are alike ill to meet with, and not seldom do much despite and mischief. And if by misadventure one of these bands should visit us while thou wert here, and marking thy youth and beauty should do thee despite and dishonor, we should be unable to afford thee any succor. This we would have thee know, that if it should so come to pass, thou mayst not have cause to reproach us." The damsel heard not the old man's word without dismay, but, seeing that the hour was now late, she answered, "God, if he be so pleased, will save both you and me from such molestation, and if not, 'tis a much lesser evil to be maltreated by men than to be torn in pieces by the wild beasts in the forest." So saying, she dismounted and entered the cottage, where, having supped with the poor man and his wife on such humble fare as they had, she laid herself in her clothes beside them in their bed. She slept not, however, for her own evil plight and that of Pietro, for whom she knew not how to augur aught but evil, kept her sighing and weeping all night long. And towards matins she heard a great noise as of men that marched. So up she got, and hied her into a large courtyard that was in the rear of the cottage, and part of which was covered with a great heap of hay, which she espying hid herself therein, that, if the men came there, they might not so readily find her. Scarce had she done so than the man, who proved to be a strong company of marauders, were at the door of the cottage, which they forced open, and having entered and found the damsel's nag still saddled, they asked who was there. The damsel being out of sight, the good man answered, "There is none here but my wife and I, but this nag, which has given some one the slip, found his way hither last night, and we housed him lest he should be devoured by the wolves." So, said the chief of the band, as he has no owner, he will come in very handy for us. Whereupon in several parties they ransacked the cottage from top to bottom, and one party went out into the courtyard, where, as they threw aside their lances and targets, it so befell that one of them, not knowing where else to bestow his lance, tossed it into the hay, and was within an ace of killing the damsel that lay hid there, as likewise she of betraying her whereabouts, for the lance all but grazing her left breast, insomuch that the head tore her apparel. She doubted she was wounded, and had given a great shriek, but that, remembering where she was, she refrained for fear. By and by the company cooked them a breakfast of kids and other meat, and having eaten and drunken, dispersed in divers directions as their affairs required, taking the girl's nag with them. And when they were gotten some little way off, the good man asked his wife, "What became of the damsel, our guest of last night, that I have not seen her since we rose?" The good woman answered that she knew not where the damsel was, and went to look for her. The damsel, discovering that the men were gone, came forth of the hay, and the good man, seeing her, was overjoyed that she had not fallen into the hands of the ruffians, and, as the day was breaking, said to her, "Now that the day is at hand, we will, so it like thee, escort thee to a castle some 5 miles hence, where thou wilt be in safety, but thou must needs go afoot, because these villains that are but just gone have taken thy nag with them." The damsel, resigning herself to her loss, besought them for God's sake to take her to the castle, whereupon they set forth and arrived there about half tierce. Now the castle belonged to one of the Orsini, Liello di Campo di Fiore by name, whose wife, as it chanced, was there. A most kindly and good woman she was, and recognizing the damsel as soon as she saw her, gave her a hearty welcome, and would fain have from her a particular account of how she came there. So the damsel told her the whole story. The lady, to whom Pietro was also known as being a friend of her husband, was distressed to hear of his misadventure, and being told where he was taken, gave him up for dead. So she said to the damsel, "Since so it is that thou knowest not how Pietro has fared, thou shalt stay here with me until such time as I may have opportunity to send thee safely back to Rome." Meanwhile Pietro, perched on his oak in as woeful a plight as might be, had espied, when he should have been in his first sleep, a full score of wolves that, as they prowled, caught sight of the nag, and straightway were upon him on all sides. The horse, as soon as he was ware of their approach, strained on their reins till they snapped, and tried to make good his escape, but being hemmed in, was brought to bay, and made a long fight of it with his teeth and hoofs, but in the end they bore him down, and throttled him, and forthwith eviscerated him, and the whole pack falling upon him, devoured him to the bone before they had done with him. Whereat Pietro, who felt that in the nag he had lost a companion and a comfort in his travail, was sorely dismayed, and began to think that he should never get out of the forest. But towards dawn he perched there in the oak, almost dead with cold, looking around him, as he frequently did, espied about a mile off a huge fire, wherefore as soon as 'twas broad day he got down, not without trepidation, from the oak, and bent his steps towards the fire, and being come to it, he found, gathered about it, a company of shepherds, eating and making merry, who took pity on him, and made him welcome. And when he had broken his fast and warmed himself, he told them the mishap that had befallen him, and how it was that he was come there alone, and asked them if there was a farm or castle in those parts whither he might betake him. The shepherds said that about 3 miles away there was a castle belonging to Liello di Campo di Fiore, where his lady was then tarrying. Pietro, much comforted, requested to be guided thither by some of their company, whereupon 2 of them right gladly escorted him. So Pietro arrived at the castle, where he found some that knew him, and while he was endeavoring to set on foot a search for the damsel in the forest, the lady summoned him to her presence, and he, forthwith obeying, and seeing Agnolella with her, was the happiest man that ever was. He yearned till he all but swooned to go and embrace her, but refrained for bashfulness in the lady's presence. And overjoyed as he was, the joy of the damsel was no less. The lady received him with great cheer, and though when she had heard the story of his adventures from his own lips, she chid him not a little for having set at naught the wishes of his kinsfolk, yet, seeing that he was still of the same mind, and that the damsel was also constant, she said to herself, "To what purpose give I myself all this trouble? They love one another, they know one another, they love with equal ardor, their love is honorable, and I doubt not is well pleasing to God, seeing that the one has escaped the gallows, and the other the lance, and both the wild beasts. Wherefore be it as they would have it." Then turning to them, she said, "If 'tis your will to be joined in wedlock as man and wife, mine jumps with it. Here shall your nuptials be solemnized, and at Liello's charges, and for the rest I will see that your peace is made with your kinsfolk." So in the castle the pair were wedded, Pietro only less blithe than Agnolella, the lady ordering the nuptials as honorably as might be in her mountain home, and there they had most sweet joyance of the first fruits of their love. So some days they tarried there, and then, accompanied by the lady with a strong escort, they took horse and returned to Rome, where, very wroth though she found Pietro's kinsfolk for what he had done, the lady re-established solid peace between him and them, and so at Rome Pietro and Agnolella lived together to a good old age in great tranquillity and happiness. End of Day 5, the third story.
Day 5, the fourth story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the fourth story. Ricciardo Monardi is found by Messer Lizio de Valbona with his daughter, whom he marries and remains at peace with her father.
In silence Elisa received the praise bestowed on her story by her fair companions, and then the queen called for a story from Philostrato, who with a laugh began on this wise.
Chiden have I been so often and by so many of you for the sore burden which I have laid upon you, of discourse harsh and meet for tears, that, as some compensation for such annoy, I deem myself bound to tell you somewhat that may cause you to laugh a little. Wherefore my story, which will be of the brightest, shall be of a love, the course whereof, save for sighs and a brief passage of fear mingled with shame, ran smooth to a happy consummation. Know then, noble ladies, 'tis no long time since there dwelt in Romagna a right worthy and courteous knight, Messer Lizio de Valbona by name, who was already verging upon old age, when there was born to him of his wife, Madonna Giacomina, a daughter, whom, as she grew up, became the fairest and most debonair of all girls of those parts, and for that she was the only daughter left to him, was most dearly loved and cherished by her father and mother, who guarded her with the most jealous care, thinking to arrange some great match for her. Now there was frequently in Messer Lizio's house, and much in his company, a fine, lusty young man, one Ricciardo de Menardi da Bretinoro, whom Messer Lizio and his wife would as little have thought of mistrusting as if he had been their own son, who, now and again taking note of the damsel, that she was very fair and graceful, and in bearing and behavior most commendable, and of marriageable age, fell vehemently in love with her, which love he was most very careful to conceal. The damsel detected it, however, and in like manner plunged headlong into love with him, to Ricciardo's no small satisfaction. Again and again he was on the point of speaking to her, but refrained for fear. At length, however, he summoned up his courage, and seizing his opportunity, thus addressed her: "Caterina, I implore thee, suffer me not to die for love of thee." Whereto the damsel forthwith responded: "Nay, God grant it that it be not rather that I die for love of thee." Greatly exhilarated and encouraged, Ricardio made answer: "'Twill never be by default of mine that thou lackest aught that may pleasure thee, but it rests with thee to find the means to save thy life and mine." Then said the damsel: "Thou seest, Ricciardo, how closely watched I am, insomuch that I see not how 'twere possible for thee to come to me; but if thou seest aught that I may do without dishonour, speak the word and I will do it." Ricciardo was silent for a while, pondering many matters; then of a sudden he said: "Sweet be Caterina, there is but one way that I can see, to wit, that thou shouldest sleep either on or where thou mightest have access to the terrace by thy father's garden, where, so I but knew that thou wouldest be there at night, I would not fail contrive to meet thee, albeit 'tis very high." "As for my sleeping there," replied Caterina, "I doubt not that it may be managed, if thou art sure that thou canst join me." Ricciardo answered in the affirmative, whereupon they exchanged a furtive kiss, and parted. On the morrow, it being now towards the close of May, the damsel began complaining to her mother that by reason of the excessive heat she had not been able to get any sleep during the night. "Daughter," said the lady, "what heat was there? Nay, there was no heat at all." "Had you said 'to my thinking,' mother," rejoined Caterina, "you would perhaps have said sooth; but you should bethink you how much more heat girls have in them than ladies that are advanced in years." "True, my daughter," returned the lady, "but I cannot order that it should be hot or cold, as thou perchance wouldst like. We must take the weather as we find it, and as the seasons provide it. Perchance tonight it will be cooler, and thou wilt sleep better." "God grant it be so," said Caterina, "but 'tis not wanted for the nights to grow cooler as the summer comes on." "What then," said the lady, "wouldst thou have me do?" "With your leave and my father's," answered Caterina, "I should like to have a little bed made up on the terrace by his room and over his garden, where, hearing the nightingale sing, and being in a much cooler place, I should sleep much better than in your room." Whereupon, "Daughter, be of good cheer," said the mother, "I will speak to thy father, and we will do as he shall decide." And so the lady told Messer Lizio what had passed between her and the damsel; but he, being old, and perhaps for that reason a little morose, said, "What nightingale is this, to whose chant she would fain sleep? I will see to it that the cicalas shall yet lull her to sleep." Which speech coming to Caterina's ears gave such offence, that for anger rather than for reason of the heat, she not only slept not herself that night, but suffered not her mother to sleep, keeping up a perpetual complaint of the great heat. Wherefore her mother hied her in the morning to Messer Lizio, and said to him, "Sir, you hold your daughter none too dear. What difference can it make to you that she lie on the terrace? She has tossed about all night long by reason of the heat, and besides, can you wonder that she, girl that she is, loves to hear the nightingale sing? Young folk naturally affect their likes." Whereto Messer Lizio made answer, "Go, make her a bed there to your liking, and set a curtain round it, and let her sleep there, and hear the nightingale sing to her heart's content." Which the damsel no sooner learned than she had a bed made there with the intent to sleep there that same night. Wherefore she watched until she saw Ricciardo, whom by a concerted sign she gave to understand what he was to do. Messer Lizio, as soon as he heard the damsel go to bed, locked a door that led from his room to the terrace, and went to sleep himself. When all was quiet, Ricciardo, with the help of a ladder, got upon a wall, and standing thereon laid hold of certain toothings of another wall, and not without great exertion and risk had he fallen, clambered up on to the terrace, where the damsel received him quietly with the heartiest of cheer. Many a kiss they exchanged, and then got them to bed, where well nigh all night long they had solace and joyance of one another, and made the nightingale sing not a few times. But, brief being the night, and great their pleasure, towards dawn, albeit they wist it not, they fell asleep, Caterina's right arm encircling Ricciardo's neck, while with her left hand she held him by that part of his person which your modesty, my ladies, is most averse to name in the company of men. So peacefully they slept, and were still asleep when day broke and Messer Lizio rose, and calling to mind that his daughter slept on the terrace, softly opened the door, saying to himself, "Let me see what sort of night's rest the nightingale has afforded our Caterina." And, having entered, he gently raised the curtain that screened the bed, and saw Ricciardo asleep with her and in her embrace as described, both being quite naked and uncovered. And having taken note of Ricciardo, he went away and hied him to his lady's room, and called her, saying, "Up, up, wife, come and see, for thy daughter has fancied the nightingale to such purpose that she has caught him, and holds him in her hand." "How can this be?" said the lady. "Come quickly, and thou shalt see," replied Messer Lizio. And so the lady huddled on her clothes, and silently followed Messer Lizio, and when they came to the bed, and had raised the curtain, Madonna Giacomo saw plainly enough how her daughter had caught and did hold the nightingale, whose song she had longed to hear. Whereat the lady, deeming that Ricciardo had played her a cruel trick, would have cried out and upbraided him, but Messer Lizio said to her, "Wife, as thou valuest my love, say not a word, for in good sooth, seeing that she has caught him, he shall be hers. Ricciardo is a gentleman and wealthy, an alliance with him cannot but be to our advantage. If he would part from me on good terms, he must first marry her, so that the nightingale shall prove to have been put in his own cage, and not in that of another." Whereby the lady was reassured, seeing that her husband took the affair so quietly, and their daughter had had a good night, and was rested, and had caught the nightingale. So she kept silence, nor had they long to wait before Ricciardo awoke, and seeing 'twas broad daylight, and deemed 'twas as much as his life was worth, aroused Caterina, saying, "Alas, my soul! What shall we do, now that day has come and surprised me here?" Which question Messer Lazio answered by coming forward and saying, "We shall do well." At sight of him Ricciardo felt as if his heart were torn out of his body, and sate up in the bed, and cried, "My lord, I cry for mercy for God's sake. I wot that my disloyalty and delinquency had merited death. Wherefore deal with me even as it may seem best to you. However, I pray to you, if so it may be to spare my life, that I die not." "Ricciardo," replied Messer Lizio, "the love I bore thee, and the faith I reposed in thee, merited a better return. But still, as so it is, and youth has seduced thee into such a transgression, redeem thy life and preserve thy honor, by making Caterina thy lawful spouse, that thine, as she has been for this past night, she may remain for the rest of her life. In this way thou mayst securest my peace and thy safety. Otherwise, commend thy soul to God." Pending this colloquy, Caterina let go the nightingale, and having covered herself, began with many a tear to implore her father to forgive Ricciardo, and Ricciardo to do as Messer Lizio required, that thereby they might securely count upon a long continuance of such nights of delight. But there needed not much supplication, for, with what remorse for the wrong done, and the wish to make amends, and the fear of death, and the desire to escape it, and above all his ardent love, and the craving to possess his beloved one, Ricciardo lost no time in making a frank avowal of his readiness to do as Messer Lizio would have him. Wherefore Messer Lizio, having borrowed a ring from Madonna Giacomo, Ricciardo did there and then in their presence wed Caterina. Which done, Messer Lizio and the lady took their leave, saying, "Now rest ye a while, for so perchance 'twere better for you than if ye rose." And so they left the young folks, who forthwith embraced, and not having travelled more than 6 miles during the night, went 2 miles further before they rose, and so concluded their first day. When they were arisen, Ricciardo and Messer Lizio discussed the matter with more formality, and some days afterwards Ricciardo, as was meet, married the damsel anew in the presence of their friends and kinsfolk, and brought her home with great pomp, and celebrated his nuptials with due dignity and splendor. And so for many a year thereafter he lived with her in peace and happiness, and snared the nightingales day and night to her heart's content. End of Day 5, the 4th story.
Day 5, the 5th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5. The fifth story. Guidotto da Cremona dies, leaving a girl to Giacomino da Pavia. She has two lovers in Faenza, to wit Gianole di Severino and Minghino di Mingole, who fight about her. She is discovered to be Gianole's sister, and is given to Minghino to wife.
All the ladies laughed so heartily over the story of the nightingale, that even when Philostrato had finished, they could not control their merriment. However, when the laughter was somewhat abated, the queen said, "Verily, if thou didst yesterday afflict us, to-day thou hast tickled us to such purpose, that none of us may justly complain of thee." Then, as the turn had now come round to Neifile, she bade her give them a story, and thus blithely Neifile began.
As Philostrato went to Romagna for the matter of his discourse, I too am fain to make a short journey through the same country in what I am about to relate to you. I say then that there dwelt of yore in the city of Fano two Lombards, the one yclept Guidotto da Cremona, and the other Giacomino da Pavia, men advanced in life, who, being soldiers, had spent the best part of their youth in feats of arms. Now Guidotto, being at the point of death, and having no son or any friend or kinsman in whom he placed more trust than in Giacomino, left him a girl of about 10 years, and all that he had in the world. And so, having given him to know not a little of his affairs, he died. About the same time, the city of Faenza, which had long been at war, and in a most sorry plight, began to recover some measure of prosperity, and thereupon liberty to return thither on honourable terms was accorded to all that were so minded. Whither accordingly Giacomino, who had dwelt there aforetime and liked the place, returned with all his goods and chattels, taking with him the girl left him by Guidotto, whom he loved and entreated as his daughter. The girl grew up as beautiful a maiden as was to be found in the city, and no less debonair and modest was she than fair. Wherefore she lacked not admirers, but above all 2 young men, both very gallant and of equal merit, the one Gianole di Severino, the other Minghino di Mingole, affected her with so ardent a passion that, growing jealous, they came to hate one another with an inordinate hatred. Right gladly would each have espoused her, she being now 15 years old, but that his kinsman forbade it. Wherefore, seeing that neither might have her in an honourable way, each determined to compass his end as best he might. Now Giacomino had in his house an ancient maid, and a man by name Crivello, a very pleasant and friendly sort of fellow, with whom Gianole grew familiar, and in due time confided to him all his love, praying him to further the attainment of his desire, and promising to reward him handsomely if he did so. Crivello made answer, "Thou must know that there is but one way in which I might be of service to thee in this affair. I might contrive that thou shouldst be where she is when Giacomino is gone off to supper, but were I to presume to say aught to her on thy behalf, she would never listen to me. This, if it please thee, I promise to do for thee, and will be as good as my word, and then thou canst do whatever thou mayst deem most expedient." Gianole said that he asked no more, and so 'twas arranged. Meanwhile, Minghino, on his part, had made friends with the maid, on whom he had so wrought that she had carried several messages to the girl, and had gone far to kindle her to his love, and furthermore had promised to contrive that he should meet her when for any cause Giacomino should be from home in the evening. And so it befell that no long time after these parleys, Giacomino, by Crivello's management, was to go sup at the house of a friend, and by pre-concert between Crivello and Giannole, upon signal given, Giannole was to come to Giacomino's house and find the door open. The maid, on her part, witting naught of the understanding between Crivello and Giannole, let Minghino know that Giacomino would not sup at home, and bade him be near the house, so that he might come and enter it on sight of a signal from her. The evening came. Neither of the lovers knew aught of what the other was about, but being suspicious of one another, they came to take possession, each with his own company of armed friends. Minghino, while awaiting the signal, rested with his company in the house of one of his friends, hard by the girl's house. Giannole, with his company, was posted a little farther off. Crivello and the maid, when Giacomino was gone, did each their endeavour to get the other out of the way. Crivello said to the maid, "How is it thou takest not thyself to bed, but goest still hither and thither about the house?" And the maid said to Crivello, "Nay, but why goest thou not after thy master? Thou hast supped, what awaitest thou here?" And so, neither being able to make the other quit the post, Crivello, the hour concerted with Giannole being come, said to himself, "What care I for her? If she will not keep quiet, 'tis like to be the worse for her." Whereupon he gave the signal, and hied him to the door, which he had no sooner opened than Giannole entered with two of his companions, and finding the girl in the saloon, laid hands on her with intent to carry her off. The girl struggled and shrieked amain, as did also the maid. Minghino, fearing the noise, hasted to the spot with his companions, and seeing that the girl was already being borne across the threshold, they drew their swords and cried out in chorus, "Ha! traitors that ye are all dead men. 'Twill go otherwise than ye think for. What means this force?" Which said, they fell upon them with their swords, while the neighbours, alarmed by the noise, came hurrying forth with lights and arms, and protested that 'twas an outrage, and took Minghino's part. So, after a prolonged struggle, Minghino wrested the girl from Giannole, and set her again in Giacomino's house. Nor were the combatants separated before the officers of the governor of the city came up, and arrested not a few of them, among them Minghino and Giannole and Crivello, whom they marched off to prison. However, peace being restored, and Giacomino returned, 'twas with no little chagrin that he heard of the affair. But finding upon investigation that the girl was in no wise culpable, he was somewhat reassured, and determined, lest the like should again happen, to bestow the girl in marriage as soon as might be. On the morrow, the kinsfolk of the two lovers, having learned the truth of the matter, and knowing what evil might ensue to the captives if Giacomino should be minded to take the course which he reasonably might, came and gave him good words, beseeching him to let the kindly feeling, the love, which they believed he bore to them, his suppliants, count for more with him than the wrong that the hare-brained gallants had done him, and on their part and their own offering to make any amend that he might require. Giacomino, who had seen many things in his time, and lacked not sound sense, made answer briefly, "Gentlemen, were I in my own country as I am in yours, I hold myself in such sort your friend, that naught would I do in this matter, or in any other, save what might be agreeable to you. Besides which, I have the more reason to consider your wishes, because 'tis against you yourselves that you have offended, inasmuch as this damsel, whatever many folk may suppose, is neither of Cremona nor of Pavia, but is of Faenza, albeit neither I nor she, nor he from whom I had her, did ever wot whose daughter she was. Wherefore, touching that you ask of me, I will even do just as you bid me." The worthy men found it passing strange that the girl should be of Faenza, and having thanked Giacomino for his handsome answer, they besought him that he would be pleased to tell them how she had come into his hands, and how he knew that she was of Faenza. To whom Giacomino replied on this wise: "A comrade and friend I had, Guidotto da Cremona, who, being at the point of death, told me that, when this city of Faenza was taken by the Emperor Frederick, he and his comrades, entering one of the houses during the sack, found there good store of booty, and never a soul save this girl, who, being 2 years old or thereabouts, greeted him as father as he came up the stairs. Wherefore he took pity on her, and carried her with whatever else was in the house away with him to Fano, where on his deathbed he left her to me, charging me in due time to bestow her in marriage, and give her all his goods and chattels by way of dowry. But, albeit she is now of marriageable age, I have not been able to provide her with a husband to my mind, though right glad should I be to do so, that naught like the event of yesterday may again befall me." Now among the rest of those present was one Guglielmo da Medicina, who had been with Guidotto on that occasion, and knew well whose house it was that Guidotto had sacked. And seeing the owner there among the rest, he went up to him and said, "Dost hear, Bernabuccio, what Giacomino says?" "Ay," answered Bernabuccio, "and I gave the more heed thereto, for that I call to mind that during those disorders I lost a little daughter of just the age that Giacomino speaks of." "'Tis verily she, then," said Guglielmo, "for once when I was with Guidotto, I heard him describe what house it was that he had sacked, and I wist that 'twas thine. Wherefore search thy memory if there be any sign by which thou thinkest to recognise her, and let her be examined, that thou mayst be assured that she is thy daughter." So Bernabuccio pondered a while, and then recollected that she ought to have a scar showing like a tiny cross above her left ear, being where he had excised a tumour a little while before that affair. Wherefore, without delay, he went up to Giacomino, who was still there, and besought him to let him go home with him and see the damsel. Giacomino gladly did so, and no sooner was the girl brought into Bernabuccio's presence than, as he beheld her, 'twas as if he saw the face of her mother, who was still a beautiful woman. However, he would not rest there, but besought Giacomino of his grace to permit him to lift a lock or two of hair above her left ear, whereto Giacomino consented. So Bernabuccio approached her where she stood somewhat shamefast, and with his right hand lifted her locks, and seeing the cross, wist that in very truth she was his daughter, and tenderly wept and embraced her, albeit she withstood him. And then, turning to Giacomino, he said, "My brother, the girl is my daughter. 'Twas my house that Guidotto sacked, and so sudden was the assault that my wife, her mother, forgot her, and we have always hitherto supposed that my house being burned that same day, she perished in the flames." Catching his words, and seeing that he was advanced in years, the girl inclined to believe him, and impelled by some occult instinct, suffered his embraces, and melting, mingled her tears with his. Bernabuccio forthwith sent for her mother and her sisters and other kinswomen and her brothers, and having shown her to them all and told the story, after they had done her great cheer and embraced her 1,000 times, to Giacomino's no small delight, he brought her home with him. Which coming to the ears of the governor of the city, the worthy man, knowing that Giannole, whom he had in ward, was Bernabuccio's son and the girl's brother, made up his mind to deal leniently with Giannole. Wherefore he took upon himself the part of mediator in the affair, and having made peace between Bernabuccio and Giacomino, and Gianole and Minghino gave Agnesa, such was the damsel's name, to Minghino to wife, to the great delight of all Minghino's kinsfolk, and set at liberty not only Gianole and Minghino, but Crivello and the others their confederates in the affair. Whereupon Minghino, with the blithest of hearts, wedded Agnesa with all due pomp and circumstance, and brought her home, where for many a year thereafter he lived with her in peace and prosperity. End of Day 5, the 5th story. Recording by Ruth Golding.
Day 5, the 6th story of the Decameron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miette. The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by J.M. Rigg. Day 5, the 6th story. Gianni di Procida, being found with a damsel that he loves, and who had been given to King Frederick, is bound with her to a stake, so to be burned. He is recognized by Ruggieri de Loria, is delivered, and marries her.
Nephilus' story, with which the ladies were greatly delighted, being ended, the queen called for one from Pampinea, who forthwith raised her noble countenance, and thus began.
Mighty indeed, gracious ladies, are the forces of love, and great are the labours, and excessive, and unthought of, the perils which they induce lovers to brave, as is manifest enough by what we have heard to-day, and on other occasions. Howbeit I mean to show you the same once more, by a story of an enamoured youth. Hard by Naples is the island of Ischia, in which there dwelt aforetime with other young damsels once, Restituta by name, daughter of one Marin Bulgaro, a gentleman of the island. Very fair was she, and blithe of heart, and by a young gallant, Gianni by name, of the neighbouring islet of Procida, was beloved more dearly than life, and in like measure returned his love. Now, not to mention his daily resort to Ischia to see her, there were times not a few when Gianni, not being able to come by a boat, would swim across from Procida by night, that he might have sight, if of naught else, at least of the walls of her house. And while their love burned thus fervently, it so befell that one summer's day, as the damsel was all alone on the seashore, picking her way from rock to rock, detaching as she went shells from their beds with a knife, she came to a recess among the rocks, where, for the sake as well of the shade as of the comfort afforded by a spring of most cool water that was there, some Sicilian gallants that were come from Naples had put in with their felucca, who, having taken note of the damsel, that she was very fair, that she was not yet aware of them, and was alone, resolved to capture her and carry her away. Nor did they fail to give effect to their resolve, but, albeit she shrieked amain, they laid hands on her, and set her aboard their boat, and put to sea. Arrived at Calabria, they fell a-wrangling as to whose agreement, and fearing that worse might befall them, and she bring misfortune upon them, they resolved with one accord to give her to Frederick, King of Sicily, who was then a young man, and took no small delight in commodities of that quality. And so, being come to Palermo, they did. Marking her beauty, the king set great store by her. But as she was somewhat indisposed, he commanded that, till she was stronger, she should be lodged and attended in a very pretty villa that was in one of his gardens, which he called Cuba. And so 'twas done. The purloining of the damsel caused no small stir in Ischia, more especially because 'twas impossible to discover by whom she had been carried off. But Gianni, more concerned than any other, despairing of finding her in Ischia, and being apprised of the course the felucca had taken, equipped one himself, and put to sea, and in hot haste scoured the whole coast from Minerva to Scalea in Calabria, making everywhere diligent search for the damsel, and in Scalea learned that she had been taken by Sicilian mariners to Palermo, whither, accordingly, he hied him with all speed, and there, after long search, discovering that she had been given to the king, who kept her at Cuba, he was sore troubled, insomuch that he now scarce ventured to hope that he should ever set eyes on her, not to speak of having her for his own again. But still, holden by love, and seeing that none there knew him, he sent the felucca away and tarried there, and frequently passing by Cuba, he chanced one day to catch sight of her at a window, and was seen of her, to their great mutual satisfaction. And Gianni, taking note that the place was lonely, made up to her, and had such speech of her as he might, and being taught by her after what fashion he must proceed, if he would have further speech of her, he departed, but not till he had made himself thoroughly acquainted with the configuration of the place. And having waited until night was come, and indeed far spent, he returned thither. And though the ascent was such that 'twould scarce have afforded lodgment to a woodpecker, won his way up and entered the garden, where, finding a pole, he set it against the window which the damsel had pointed out as hers, and thereby swarmed up easily enough. The damsel had aforetime shown herself somewhat distant towards him, being careful of her honour, but now deeming it already lost, she had bethought her that there was none to whom she might more worthily give herself than to him, and reckoning upon inducing him to carry her off, she had made up her mind to gratify his every desire, and to that end had left the window open that his ingress might be unimpeded. So, finding it open, Gianni softly entered, lay down beside the damsel, who was awake, and before they went further, opened to him all in her mind, beseeching him most earnestly to take her thence and carry her off. Gianni replied that there was naught that would give him so much pleasure, and that without fail, upon leaving her, he would make all needful arrangements for bringing her away when he next came. Whereupon, with exceeding great delight, they embraced one another, and plucked that boon that which love has no greater to bestow. And having so done divers times, they unwittingly fell asleep in one another's arms. Now, towards daybreak, the king, who had been greatly charmed with the damsel at first sight, happened to call her to mind, and feeling himself fit, resolved, notwithstanding the hour, to go lie with her a while. And so, attended by a few of his servants, he hied him privily to Cuba. Having entered the house, he passed, the door being softly opened, into the room in which he knew the damsel slept. A great blazing torch was borne before him, and so, as he bent his glance on the bed, he espied the damsel and Gianni lying asleep, naked, and in one another's arms. Whereat he was seized with a sudden and vehement passion of wrath, insomuch that, albeit he said never a word, he could scarce refrain from slaying both of them then and there with a dagger that he had with him. Then, bethinking him that 'twere the depth of baseness in any man, not to say a king, to slay two naked sleepers, he mastered himself, and determined to do them to death in public and by fire. Wherefore, turning to a single companion that he had with him, he said, "What thinkest thou of this base woman in whom I had placed my hope?" And then he asked whether he knew the gallant that had presumed to enter his house to do him such outrage and despite. Whereto the other replied that he minded not ever to have seen him. Thereupon the king hied him out of the room in a rage, and bade take the two lovers, naked as they were, and bind them, and, as soon as 'twas broad day, bring them to Palermo, and bind them back to back on a stake in the piazza, there to remain until tierce, that all might see them, after which they were to be burned, as they had deserved. And having so ordered, he went back to Palermo and shut himself up in his room, very wroth. No sooner was he gone than there came unto the two lovers folk not a few, who, having awakened them, did forthwith ruthlessly take and bind them, whereat how they did grieve and tremble for their lives, and weep and bitterly bewail their fate, may readily be understood. Pursuant to the king's commandment, they were brought to Palermo and bound to a stake in the piazza, and before their eyes faggots and fire were made ready to burn them at the hour appointed by the king. Great was the concourse of the folk of Palermo, both men and women, that came to see the two lovers, the men all agog to feast their eyes on the damsel, whom they lauded for shapeliness and loveliness, and no less did the women commend the gallant, whom in like manner they crowded to see for the same qualities. Meanwhile the two hapless lovers, both exceeding shamefast, stood with bent heads bitterly bewailing their evil fortune, and momently expecting their death by the cruel fire. So they awaited the time appointed by the king. But their offence being bruited abroad, the tidings reached the ears of Ruggieri de Loria, a man of peerless worth, and at that time the king's admiral, who, being likewise minded to see them, came to the place where they were bound, and after gazing on the damsel and finding her very fair, turned to look at the gallant, whom with little trouble he recognized. And drawing near to him, he asked him if he were Gianni de Procida. Gianni raised his head, and recognizing the admiral, made answer, "My lord, he of whom you speak I was, but I am now as good as no more." The admiral then asked him what it was that he had brought him to such a pass. The admiral then asked him what it was that had brought him to such a pass. Whereupon, "Love and the king's wrath," quoth Johnny. The admiral induced him to be more explicit, and having learned from him exactly how it had come about, was turning away when Johnny called him back, saying, "Oh, my lord, if it so may be, procure me one favour of him by whose behest I thus stand here." "What favour?" demanded Ruggieri. "I see," returned Johnny, "that die I must, and that right soon I crave then as a favour that, whereas this damsel and I, that have loved one another more dearly than life, are here set back to back, we may be set face to face, that I may have the consolation of gazing on her face as I depart." Ruggieri laughed as he replied, "With all my heart, I will so order it that thou shalt see enough of her to tire of her." He then left him and charged the executioners to do nothing more without further order of the king. And being assured of their obedience, he hied him forthwith to the king, to whom, albeit he found him in a wrathful mood, he spared not to speak his mind, saying, "Sire, wherein have they wronged thee, these two young folk, whom thou hast ordered to be burned down there in the piazza?" The king told him, whereupon Ruggieri continued, "Their offence does indeed merit such punishment, but not at thy hands. And if misdeeds should go unpunished, services should not go unrewarded. Nay, may warrant indulgences and mercy. Knowst thou who they are whom thou wouldst have burned?" The king signified that he did not know. Whereupon Ruggieri, "But I," quoth he, "am minded that thou shouldst know them, to the end that thou mayst know with what discretion thou surrenderest thyself to a transport of rage. The young man is the son of Landolfo du Procida, brother of Messer Gianni du Procida, to whom thou owest it that thou art lord and king of this island. The damsel is a daughter of Marin Bulgaro, whose might alone today prevents Ischia from throwing off thy yoke. Moreover, these young folk have long been lovers, and 'tis for that the might of love constrained them, and not that they would do despite to thy lordship, that they have committed this offence, if indeed 'tis met to call that an offence which young folk do for love's sake. Wherefore, then, wouldst thou do them to death, when thou shouldst rather do them all cheer, and honour them with lordly gifts?" The king gave ear to Ruggieri's words, and being satisfied that he spoke sooth, repented him, not only of his evil purpose, but of what he had already done, and forthwith gave order to loose the two young folk from the stake, and bring them before him, and so 'twas done. And having finally apprised himself of their case, he saw fit to make them amends of the wrong he had done them, with honours and largesse. Wherefore he caused them to be splendidly arrayed, and being assured that they were both minded to wed, he himself gave Gianni his bride, and loading them with rich presents, set them well content back to Ischia, where they were welcomed with all festal cheer, and lived a long time thereafter to their mutual solace and delight. End of Day 5, the 6th story. Recording by Miette.